Caleb Mercer opened the door, looked at his brother's widow standing in the mud with three small boys at her side, and said, "You're not my responsibility," then shut it in her face. Not slowly, not with hesitation. He closed it the way a man closes a door on a draft, like she was just cold air. The bolt clicked. Evelyn Harper stood there in the street of Black Ridge, Colorado, in October of 1881, with the sky going dark and the wind picking up, and her youngest, Tommy, pressing his face into her coat because he didn't understand what had just happened and she didn't have the words to explain it. Her middle boy, Daniel, understood. She could see it in his jaw, the way it tightened, the way a 9-year-old learns in a single second that the world is not arranged the way his mother told him it was. And Marcus, her oldest at 12, stood a half step behind her with his hands balled into fists and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The town watched. That was the part that would stay with her longest. Not the cold, not the hunger, not the sound of the bolt. The watching. A man outside the feed store had stopped stacking crates. A woman across the street had pulled her shawl tighter and looked away. A group of men near the saloon had gone quiet, in the particular way men go quiet when they've witnessed something they don't intend to involve themselves in. Evelyn did not cry. She would think about that later, why she didn't cry. And she would decide it wasn't strength. It was simply that she had already spent everything she had in her just getting here, and there was nothing left for tears. She turned away from the door and looked at the street in front of her and tried to remember if she had ever been this afraid. She had not. She had left Memphis 3 months earlier with her husband James and their boys and everything they owned, loaded into a wagon that James had insisted was sound, and that had in fact proven to be mostly sound. James had been a man of moderate confidence and great affection, a furniture maker by trade who had read too many newspaper accounts of Colorado and decided that a man with strong hands and a willing spirit could make something of himself on the frontier. Evelyn had not shared his certainty, but she had shared his life for 13 years, and she understood that some arguments were simply delays, not changes of direction. James died of fever 6 weeks in. It happened fast, 3 days from the first cough to the end, and Evelyn had buried him in a stretch of Kansas plain with no marker she could be certain would still be standing a year later. The boys had stood around the mound of earth in the morning light, and she had tried to give them something to hold on to, and had managed only the truth, that their father had loved them, that he had been a good man, and that they were going to keep moving because there was nothing behind them anymore. She did not tell them that she had cried herself hollow every night for the following 2 weeks while they slept. James had spoken of his brother Caleb the way men speak of family they haven't seen in years, with a kind of hazy warmth that may have owed more to distance than to actual affection. Caleb was settled in Black Ridge. Caleb had a house. Caleb was blood, and blood meant something, especially out here, especially now. That had been the plan. That had been the entire plan. She should have written ahead, she knew that now, but she hadn't had a reliable address, and the journey had taken longer than expected, and she had told herself that Caleb was James's brother, and surely that counted for something. It had not counted for anything. Plus, the first thing she needed was to get her boys out of the wind. The wagon was at the edge of town where she'd left it. The same wagon, now listing slightly on the rear left wheel, which had developed a crack somewhere in the mountain pass, and which she'd been nursing along through careful handling and a kind of willful refusal to acknowledge how bad it actually was. She had 62 cents. She had a canvas tent that had kept out moderate rain, but would not keep out a mountain winter. She had a cast iron skillet, a change of clothes for each of the boys, half a sack of cornmeal, a Bible her mother had given her, and a photograph of James that she kept in the inside pocket of her coat. She also had a very clear understanding that she could not stay in Black Ridge. Not after what had just happened. She had seen the way people looked at a woman in her position, a widow with children and no money and no connections and no leverage. And she knew that look did not lead anywhere she wanted to go. Marcus climbed up onto the wagon without being asked. Daniel helped Tommy up beside him, then pulled himself up after. They were good boys. They had always been good boys, and the journey had made them better in the ways that hard things make children better, and worse, in the ways that hard things make everyone worse. Evelyn stood at the side of the wagon and thought. She needed work. She needed shelter before the storm hit. And the sky had that particular gray-green quality that meant the storm would hit tonight. She needed food. She needed the wheel fixed, which would cost money she didn't have. She needed all of these things at once, and she had approximately none of the resources required to address any of them. Mama, that was Daniel. What are we going to do? I'm thinking, she said. Are you? Daniel. She said it quiet and flat, and he understood. She looked back at the town. She had walked through it on the way to Caleb's house. A main street, a feed store, a smithy, a saloon, a dry goods operation, a small building with a sign that said Black Ridge Courier in hand-painted letters, a church, a school that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. The school caught her attention and then let it go. She was looking for something more immediate. The smithy. She walked over to the wagon and took the skillet from under the seat. It was her best piece. Good cast iron, heavy, well-seasoned, worth something to a man who knew quality. Stay here, she told the boys. Don't talk to anyone. Marcus said, What are you doing with the skillet? Business, she said. What? The smith's name was Aldous Pratt, and he was a compact man in his 50s with burned forearms and the manner of someone who had heard a great many hard luck stories and found most of them unpersuasive. He looked at Evelyn when she walked in, looked at the skillet she was carrying, and went back to what he was doing. I need my rear wheel repaired, she said. The left rear. There's a crack in the rim. I can't pay money, but I can pay this. She set the skillet on the workbench beside him. It's good iron. You can feel the weight. He picked it up, turned it over, set it down. Wheels cracked all the way through? It's cracked enough that I won't make it 50 miles. Where are you trying to get to? She had not until that moment decided where she was trying to get to. I heard there's a ranch beyond the mountains, a man named Voss. Something shifted in Pratt's expression. Not quite surprise, not quite interest, but something that wasn't pure indifference either. Ronan Voss. Do you know him? Everybody knows of him. He picked up the skillet again, set it down. You know what that property is like, distance-wise? I know it's not here, Evelyn said. He looked at her for a moment, a long, appraising look that she held without flinching. She had been looked at that way enough times on this journey to know that you either held it or you lost whatever leverage you had. Storm's coming tonight, he said. I know that. Take me an hour to pull the wheel and fix the rim. Maybe more. I'll wait. He turned back to his fire. There's a lean-to around the side. Kids can get out of the wind. She looked at him. He didn't look back. Thank you, she said. He grunted and picked up his hammer. The storm hit around 10 that night, and it was worse than the sky had advertised. Evelyn sat in the lean-to with her boys pressed against her on both sides, and Tommy asleep across her lap, and listened to the wind tear at the roof above them, and thought about Caleb Mercer closing that door. She had known James's family only through letters and James's accounts, and she had constructed from these a version of Caleb that was perhaps more generous than the original. She had imagined a hard man, but a decent one. She had imagined someone who would take them in grudgingly, who would make them feel the charity of it, who would require something from her, work or gratitude or some form of accommodation, before he opened his home. She had prepared herself for all of that. She had not prepared for the bolt. Marcus was awake beside her. She could feel it in the quality of his stillness. What are we really doing? He said, low enough that Daniel wouldn't hear if he was sleeping. We're waiting out the storm. After that, she thought about lying to him and decided he was 12 and had buried his father in Kansas and had earned the truth. There's a man named Ronan Voss who owns a ranch west of here, up past the mountain pass. I heard about him from the smith. He needs workers, and I'm going to see if he'll take us on. Workers for what? Ranch work. Cooking, cleaning, management, whatever he needs. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Can you do that? She almost laughed. I managed a household for 13 years. I can manage anything. What if he says no? Then I'll find something else. She said it with more certainty than she felt, because that was the particular job of a mother, to be more certain than the situation warranted, to hold the shape of the future steady when everything around it was shifting. Marcus, listen to me. I'm listening. I'm going to find us a way through this. I don't know exactly what it looks like yet, but I have never in my life let a closed door be the end of the story. She paused. Your uncle closed a door today. That was his choice, and he'll have to live with it. It's not our problem anymore. Marcus said nothing for a long time, then, I didn't like him anyway. You never met him. I didn't like how he sounded when Papa talked about him. She thought about that. Your father was a kinder person than I am, she said. He saw the best in people. That was one of the things I loved about him. She shifted slightly, careful not to wake Tommy. I prefer to see people accurately. She could feel Marcus turn the word over. Does that mean you knew Uncle Caleb would do that? I hoped he wouldn't, she said. That's different from expecting he wouldn't. Well, Pratt had the wheel fixed before the storm hit, and he had done something else she hadn't asked for. He'd repacked the wheel grease and tightened the other three as well, which she discovered the next morning when she went to inspect the wagon in the gray post-storm light. The lean-to had held. The wagon had held. The boys were stiff and cold and hungry, and she gave them the last of the cornmeal mashed with water over a small fire and watched them eat with the focused silence of children who have stopped complaining because they understand it doesn't change anything. She owed Pratt more than a skillet, and she told him so. He shrugged. You'll have a harder road than most, he said, which was not exactly a compliment and not exactly sympathy, but contained a kind of rough acknowledgement that she found she needed more than she expected. What can you tell me about Ronan Voss? She asked. Pratt considered this. He lost his wife and daughter some years back. Fever took the wife. The girl drowned in the spring runoff. He's been out there alone since, him and a couple of hands. The property's good land, good water, but he's let it go some. Too much for one man who's half given up on it. Why hasn't he hired help before? He has. It doesn't stick. Pratt turned to watch a sparrow on the fence post across the yard. He's not an easy man to work for. Or around. I'm not looking for easy, Evelyn said. No, he said. I don't suppose you are. He told her the route. He told her about the pass, and where the road was reliable, and where it wasn't, and where she should make camp if the second day ran long. He did all of this without her asking, and when she thanked him again, he shook his head like the thanks embarrassed him. She loaded the boys into the wagon and took up the reins and turned west. The town watched her go. She didn't look back. The road to the Voss ranch was not a road in any formal sense. It was a pair of ruts in the earth that suggested someone had made this journey before with a loaded wagon, and that was the extent of the guidance it provided. The mountain pass Pratt had described took most of the first day, and the descent on the western side was the most frightened she had been since Kansas. The road narrow and the drop sheer on one side, and the wheel she'd been worrying about now repaired but still in her mind, the crack gone, but the memory of it not. Daniel fell asleep against the side of the wagon at midday. Tommy had invented a game that involved counting types of rocks and narrating his count to no one in particular, and the sound of his voice, 7, that's a brown one, 8, 9, that's a gray one, was the most comforting thing she had heard in weeks. Marcus rode up beside her on the bench. How far? He said. Pratt said 2 days. Maybe 3 if the road slows us. Marcus watched the terrain ahead. His face had changed since James died. Not in any dramatic way, but in the accumulation of small changes, like a sketch that someone has kept going back to and adding lines to. He was starting to look less like a boy making a face and more like a man beginning to have one. What was it like, he said, when you and Papa first started out? Before Daniel and me? The question caught her sideways. Why do you ask? He shrugged. You never talk about it. She thought for a moment about the shape of those years. The small apartment in Memphis, the smell of wood shavings James brought home with him, the way they had argued about money and then stopped arguing and started planning, how those were almost the same thing. It was ordinary in most ways, she said. We were poor and young and we didn't know what we were doing. We made a great many mistakes. She glanced at him. We were happy, though, genuinely happy. Not the kind you have to convince yourself of. Do you miss it? I miss him, she said. The early days are gone anyway. Things change. He was quiet. Then, are you scared? She kept her eyes on the road. Yes. Of what? Of arriving and being turned away again. Of getting there and it being worse than here. She stopped. Reconsidered how much of this he actually needed. I'm scared of a lot of things, Marcus. I just don't let the fear make my decisions. He seemed to consider this for a long time. That's what you should do, he finally said, not quite to her. That's what you should do. She didn't ask him what he meant. She thought she understood. The wagon rolled on. The mountains opened up ahead of them into long brown valley and a sky that for the first time in weeks wasn't threatening anything. Tommy reported that he had counted 41 rocks, then fell asleep. Daniel woke up, looked around, and immediately demanded to know if they were there yet. They were not there yet, but they were closer than they had been, and in the absence of anything better to hold on to, she held on to that. On the third morning, she saw the Voss ranch from the ridge above it, a cluster of buildings in a shallow valley, a long low house, 2 outbuildings, a barn that looked solid, pasture fencing that needed work. There was smoke from the chimney. "Is that it?" Daniel said. "That's it." She looked at it for a long moment from the ridge. She thought about Caleb's door. She thought about the bolt. She thought about Pratt saying he's not an easy man to work for. And she thought about everything she had survived in the past 3 months. The fever, the burial in Kansas, the mountain pass, the storm. And she thought about 62 cents and an empty skillet and 3 boys who needed more than a lean-to. Then she clicked the horses forward and started down the ridge. Whatever was waiting for her at the bottom, she was done being afraid of closed doors. The road down from the ridge was steeper than it looked from the top, and halfway down the left front wheel hit a buried rock, and the wagon lurched hard enough to knock Daniel sideways into the sideboards. He caught himself and said nothing, which was how she knew it had scared him. Daniel, when he wasn't scared, had something to say about everything. Evelyn steadied the horses and kept them at a slow walk the rest of the way down. The valley opened up around them as they descended, and the ranch resolved itself from a general impression into specific details. The house was larger than it had appeared from above, built from dark timber that had weathered to gray, a covered porch running the length of the front. The barn stood to the left and was in better condition than anything else on the property. Between the house and the barn was a yard of packed dirt, and standing in the middle of that yard, watching her come down the road, was a man. He didn't move toward her. He didn't move away. He just stood there with his arms at his sides and watched her come, and she had enough time descending that last quarter mile to study him without appearing to. He was tall and lean in the way of men who work outdoors and don't eat enough, somewhere in his early 40s, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a beard that suggested not careful grooming but simple indifference to it. He was wearing a coat that had been good quality once and wasn't anymore, and his boots were the boots of a man who spent serious hours on his feet. She pulled the wagon to a stop 10 feet from him. He looked at her. He looked at Marcus beside her on the bench. He looked at Daniel and Tommy in the bed of the wagon, and then he looked back at her. "You're lost," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm not lost," she said. "Are you Ronan Voss?" A pause. "I am." "My name is Evelyn Harper. I came from Blackridge. I was told you need help on this property." He looked at the wagon again, then back at her face, with the expression of a man who has been told something he suspects is not entirely accurate. "Who told you that?" "A man named Pratt, the smith in Blackridge." Something moved in his expression. Brief recognition, then a kind of shuttered blankness. "Pratt talks too much. He told me you needed workers. I'm a worker. I can cook, manage a household, keep accounts, tend to sick livestock if needed, and I can do it for room, board, and a small wage until we get settled." She kept her voice level. "I have 3 sons. They're well-behaved and old enough to be useful." Ronan Voss looked at her for a long time without speaking. The wind moved through the valley. One of the horses shifted. "No," he said. She had prepared herself for this. She had prepared herself on the ridge, and on the road from Blackridge, and in the lean-to during the storm. She had rehearsed this exact moment. And still, hearing the word come out of his mouth with that flat finality, it hit her somewhere below the ribs. "Mr. Voss," she said, and she heard the controlled quality of her own voice, the effort in it. "I have 62 cents, a cracked, recently repaired wagon, and 3 children who have been sleeping rough for 3 days. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for a job." "I've had help before," he said. "It doesn't work." "I'm not whoever you had before." "No," he agreed. "You're a woman with children, which is considerably more complicated." She held the reins tighter than she needed to. "What is it that concerns you, the children being disruptive or the work itself?" "Both." "My boys don't disrupt, they work. Marcus is 12, Daniel is 9, Tommy is 6 and still learning, but he follows instruction." She paused. Tell me what the biggest problem is on this property right now, and I'll tell you whether I can address it. He looked at her like she'd said something unexpected. Then, against what appeared to be his better judgment, he glanced toward the house. The stove's been out for a week. Flue's blocked. My two hands have been eating cold food, and they're about done with it. I can't fix a flue. I can fix a flue, she said. He met her eyes. You can fix a flue. I've fixed 3. It's not complicated if you know what you're doing. She kept his gaze. Let me fix the flue. If I can't do it, or if I make it worse, I'll leave without argument. But if I fix it, you let us stay 1 week and see whether we're a problem or a solution. He was quiet for what felt like a very long time. A door opened somewhere behind him, one of the outbuildings, and a man appeared briefly, looked at the wagon, and disappeared again. 1 week, Ronan Voss said finally, and it came out like something being dragged across gravel. Evelyn set the brake on the wagon. Thank you. He turned and walked back toward the house without another word, which she took as an instruction to follow him. She climbed down from the wagon and turned to the boys. Marcus was already moving to get down. Daniel was right behind him. Tommy had fallen asleep again. He was doing that more often now, and she made a note of it, the way she made notes of everything about her children, that constant low-level monitoring that mothers do and rarely acknowledge. Marcus, she said, quietly enough that Voss wouldn't hear, get Tommy settled in the wagon and stay with him until I come back. Daniel, come with me. Don't speak unless someone speaks to you first. Marcus nodded. Daniel fell into step beside her. The inside of the house was dim and cold and cluttered in the way of a place where one person has been living for a long time without caring much about the accumulation of things. There was a table with papers on one end and a kerosene lamp and a coffee cup that had been there long enough to leave a ring. There was a good chair by the cold fireplace and a less good chair across from it. The kitchen was a separate room at the back of the house, and the problem was immediately obvious. The flue pipe from the cook stove connected to the chimney through a section of wall, and someone had tried to clear an obstruction at some point and given up halfway, leaving a section of pipe slightly misaligned and the whole chimney drawing wrong. Daniel looked at it. He was a practical boy, had always been practical. James's son in that way specifically, with James's eye for how things fit together. Bird nest, Daniel said. She looked up. He was right. She could see the edge of it where the pipe met the chimney brick. One of the ranch hands appeared in the doorway, the man she'd seen briefly outside. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with a face that had the particular blankness of someone waiting to see which way a situation was going to fall. Pete, Ronan said from behind her. She hadn't heard him come in. Morning, the hand said, to no one in particular. Ronan looked at Evelyn. She says she can fix the flue. Pete looked at Evelyn, then at Daniel, then back at Evelyn. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but something in it shifted into a cautious, watchful interest. Got a bird in there 2 weeks ago, he said. Tried to clear it with a poker. Didn't help. I'll need a ladder, Evelyn said, and a length of rope, and something I can weight the end of. A rock will do. And rags. Clean ones, or clean enough. Pete looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at the ceiling. Get her what she needs, he said, and walked back toward the front of the house. It took her 40 minutes. She went up on the roof and dropped the weighted rope down the chimney from the top, and the nest came apart and fell in pieces, and Daniel fed the rags up through the access panel at the bottom to catch most of what came down. She had done this before, twice in Memphis when her neighbor's chimney kept smoking, once in the house she and James had rented the first 2 years. And the principle was the same every time. It wasn't complicated, it just required someone willing to get dirty and go up on the roof. When she came back down, Pete had a fire going in the stove within 10 minutes. The draw was clean. The kitchen began to warm. She stood at the sink and washed her hands and face, and when she turned around, Ronan Voss was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, and an expression that was not quite surprise but had elements of it. You've done that before, he said. I said I had. He looked at the fire for a moment. Your boy, Daniel, he helped. He did. A long silence. There's a room at the back, small. The 4 of you'll be crowded. We've been sleeping in a wagon, she said. We'll manage. He nodded once, turned, and was gone. Pete, still tending the fire, said, without looking at her, He's better than he seems. She said, Most people are. He glanced at her then. A quick look, something close to amusement. You need help unloading? I'd appreciate it. The room was, in fact, small. It had been a storage room at some point, and there was still a smell of oats and dry wood in the walls, which was not unpleasant. There was a single window, a plank floor, and 4 hooks on the wall. Pete and Marcus carried in a cot from somewhere that Evelyn didn't ask about, and she arranged their things against the wall, which didn't take long, there being few of them. And when Tommy woke up from his nap in the wagon, she carried him inside, and he looked around the small room and said, in the simple declarative voice of a 6-year-old, "Is this where we live now?" She was hanging their single spare blanket over the window. "For now," she said. "Is there food?" "Food? There will be." He thought about this. "Okay," he said, and sat down on the cot and immediately began examining the knots in the wood of the wall beside him, which was Tommy's way of being comfortable somewhere, to start looking at the details. She found the kitchen provisioned with the basics and not much more. Dried beans, a sack of flour, salt pork, some root vegetables that needed using before they went bad, a tin of lard, a small cache of dried apples that had been there long enough to be nearly tasteless. She took inventory methodically, the way her mother had taught her, working through what she had and what could be made from it before deciding on anything. She made a bean soup with the salt pork and the root vegetables and a pan of cornbread from the flour. It wasn't impressive, but it was hot, and hot mattered more than impressive. At supper, the 2 hands, Pete was the younger one, and the older was named Gideon, a quiet man in his 50s with a gray beard and slow, deliberate movements, ate at the kitchen table with the boys. Ronan ate at the front room table. Not out of ceremony, Evelyn understood quickly, but out of habit. It was where he had been eating alone, and he continued to eat alone, and she did not try to change it, but he ate all of what she'd sent in. So did Gideon and Pete. Daniel ate 2 portions. Tommy fell asleep before he finished his bowl, and she carried him to the cot and sat beside him for a moment in the small dark room and let herself briefly feel the specific exhaustion of a person who has been holding things together for so long that the simple act of stopping movement feels dangerous. She let herself sit for exactly 3 minutes. Then she got up and went back to the kitchen and washed the dishes. The week that followed was the hardest kind of hard. Not dramatic, not crisis, but grinding and consistent. The sort of difficulty that doesn't make a good story, but wears through people like water through stone. She woke before light every morning and had the stove going by the time the hands came in from their first check of the livestock. She made breakfast and dinner and handled whatever needed handling in between, which turned out to be considerable. Mending that had piled up for months. A root cellar that needed reorganizing because several of the stored vegetables were beginning to rot and contaminating the ones around them. A window in the bunkhouse that had been letting in weather since September and simply required someone to cut a proper piece of wood and fit it. She also took stock of the ranch itself, not intrusively. She wasn't pushing into anyone's business, but in the natural way of a person who was good at understanding systems. She asked questions when she had a reason to. She listened to Pete and Gideon talk about the livestock and the pasture condition and the fencing that had been failing along the east boundary, and she absorbed it all and said nothing about it yet. Ronan Voss largely ignored her, not rudely, not with any particular intent. He was simply a man who had organized his life around not needing to interact with people, and he continued that organization. He said good morning when she handed him his coffee. He said thank you when food appeared. Beyond that, he was elsewhere, out on the range, or in the small office off the main room where he kept what she guessed were the ranch accounts, or simply somewhere she wasn't. On the 4th day, she discovered why he wasn't managing the east fence. She had sent Marcus out with Pete that morning to learn how to check the fence line. Marcus needed work that mattered, something physical enough to satisfy the particular energy of a 12-year-old boy trying to be useful. And Pete had brought him back at noon with the fence report, which was that a section of about 40 yards had collapsed entirely, and the cattle had been drifting through it for at least a week. She found Ronan in the office. She had not been in the office before. It was small and spare, a desk and 2 chairs and a shelf of account ledgers, and the desk was covered with papers in a way that looked disorganized but might not be. He looked up when she came in with the irritation of a man who has arranged his life specifically to minimize interruption. "The east fence," she said. "Pete says 40 yards are down." "I know about the east fence. The cattle have been going through it." I know about the cattle. He said it flat, but not quite sharp, more like the flatness of someone who has been carrying a problem and doesn't appreciate being reminded of it. I need posts. I don't have the money for posts right now. She considered this. What about the lumber from the broken outbuilding, the one on the north side that's half collapsed? The timber in that wall is still good. He looked at her steadily. You've been assessing the property. I've been working on the property, she said. It's hard to miss things when you're working. A long pause. He picked up a pencil and put it down. The outbuilding timber would need splitting. Marcus can split timber. I'll work beside him. He looked at the desk surface, not at her. Why are you telling me this instead of just doing it? Because it's your property and your decision. I'm not in the habit of making decisions about things that don't belong to me without asking first. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a tone that was slightly different, less guarded, something closer to ordinary. All right, use the timber. She nodded and turned to go. Mrs. Harper. She stopped. The soup last night, he said, with the whatever that was. Dried apples and salt pork. It's a thing my mother used to make. He nodded once, still looking at the desk. It was good. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a moment and thought that this was how it worked out here. Not through declaration or drama, but through accumulated small moments, the flue, the root cellar, the fence, the soup, each one a brick laid in a wall, and she would not know for a long time how high the wall would go or what it was ultimately going to hold up, but she would keep laying bricks. On the 5th day, Tommy got into trouble. She heard about it secondhand from Daniel, who had witnessed it, and came to find her with the specific expression of a child who is about to deliver news he considers simultaneously serious and faintly entertaining. Tommy had found his way into the barn during the afternoon, had climbed the loft ladder, had reached the top, and had then apparently discovered that he did not actually like heights, and had sat up there for 45 minutes, too scared to come down and too stubborn to call for help. It was Gideon who found him. The older hand had gone to the barn for something and heard the sound. Evelyn imagined it was the particular controlled silence of a 6-year-old refusing to cry, and had climbed up and come down with Tommy tucked under one arm, matter of fact about it, no ceremony. When she heard this, she found Gideon outside the bunkhouse and thanked him. He nodded and said, Boy's not afraid, just overreached himself. He paused. Happens. She thought there was something in the way he said it that was meant for her as well, and she decided to accept it. Tommy, for his part, was unrepentant. I wanted to see the whole ranch from up high, he told her. And did you? Partway, he said. It's bigger than it looks. That evening at supper, she heard laughter from the kitchen table for the first time. Pete telling some story she didn't catch all of, and Daniel saying something back that made Pete laugh again, and Tommy's voice in the middle of it explaining the loft situation with the total earnestness of a small child who doesn't fully understand that he's being laughed at, but is enjoying the attention. She was at the stove with her back to the table. She kept her face forward. In the front room, the sound of Ronan's chair scraping. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, coffee cup in hand, looking at the table. He looked at it for a moment, not quite the way you'd look at a fire you've been watching alone for a long time, and then suddenly find someone sitting beside, but something in that general range of expression. Then he saw her watching him and looked away. More coffee? She asked. No, he said, and went back to the front room. But he had stood in that doorway for a moment and listened to her son's laugh in his kitchen, and she filed that away with everything else. On the 6th day, the weather turned. Not the dramatic violence of the storm that had caught them in Blackridge, but a steady cold rain that began before sunrise and showed no intention of stopping, a rain that drove through every gap in the walls and settled a damp chill into everything. Gideon came in at breakfast moving stiffly. His joints, Pete explained in a low voice, were bad in the wet, and Evelyn gave him her chair by the stove and made him eat sitting down, which he protested and then accepted. She noticed Ronan watching this from the doorway again. Later that morning, while the rain kept everyone inside, she found herself in the office again, this time because she had seen, in the root cellar inventory she'd done, a discrepancy that bothered her. She knocked on the doorframe. The dried goods inventory, she said. Who keeps the accounts for the supply orders? Ronan looked up. He did not look pleased to see her, but he had, she was noticing, a face that defaulted to unpleased even when he wasn't. I do. There are things in that root cellar that shouldn't still be here. You've been ordered twice the amount of lard and half the flour you actually use. Someone has been giving you a bad calculation, or someone has been taking the difference." He looked at her carefully. "What do you mean taking the difference?" "I mean that your supply order says 40 pounds of flour for the last 4 months, and you have 20 pounds in the cellar and usage doesn't account for the other 20. Either the order was wrong or the delivery was short and no one noticed, or—" She let the rest sit without saying it. He was very still. "Or someone has been pulling from the delivery before it gets here." "I don't know that. I only know the numbers don't match." He held out his hand. She gave him the paper she'd made her notes on. Just a list of numbers. Nothing editorial. He read it. She watched his face tighten by degrees the way a rope tightens when weight is added to it. "This goes back 4 months," he said. "That's as far back as I was able to check." He looked at the paper for a long moment. "The delivery comes from a man named Weller in Blackridge. He has a contract for the year." "I don't know whether it's the delivery or the record keeping," she said, "but I thought you should know." He set the paper down and rubbed the back of his neck. "You've been here 6 days." "Yes." "And you found this in 6 days." "I was doing inventory. It was visible if you were looking at the numbers." He said something under his breath that she didn't quite catch. Then, "I've been looking at these numbers for 4 months." "You've been looking at a great many things," she said, carefully neutral. 4 months is a long time to be managing this property alone." He looked up at her sharply, like he was deciding whether she'd intended something by that, and she held his gaze and let him decide. He looked back at the paper. "I'll deal with Weller." "That's your business," she said. "I just thought you should know." She was almost to the door when he said, again with that quality of reluctant plainness, "The week's up tomorrow." She turned. "You found the supply problem," he said. "Pete tells me your son helped him pull fence posts from the north outbuilding and the east line is half repaired. Gideon—" He stopped. "Gideon doesn't say much to anyone. He told me this morning that the bunkhouse window was fixed." She waited. "I'm not a man who makes decisions fast," he said, "but I can recognize when something is working." "Is that a yes?" He picked up his pencil. "It's a yes." She nodded and went back to the kitchen, and she stood at the counter and breathed in and breathed out. And she thought about James, and about Memphis, and about Kansas, and about Caleb Mercer's door, and she thought about 62 cents and a cracked wheel, and she thought, all right, it was not triumphant, it was not relief exactly, it was more the feeling of a foundation, something you could stand on and begin to build from, brick by brick, in the grinding, ordinary way that things actually get built. The second week was different from the first, in the way that working for something you've secured is different from working for something you're still trying to earn. The quality of the effort was the same, but the shape of each day had a looseness to it that the first week hadn't. Marcus had become Pete's shadow, in the particular way of a 12-year-old boy who has found a man he can learn from and doesn't want to waste the opportunity. Pete was patient with him in the straightforward way of someone who finds practical work easier to share than conversation. And Marcus absorbed everything and asked the right questions and made the wrong mistakes exactly once before correcting them. She watched this from a distance and felt something unlock slightly in her chest. Daniel discovered the horses. Not in a reckless way. Daniel was never reckless. He was methodical, the kind of child who had to understand a thing before he would touch it. But in a steady, deliberate way, spending time in the barn before breakfast and after supper, watching, learning the horses' individual personalities, which were specific and consistent the way horses' personalities always are. By the second week, he had identified which one was dominant and which one was nervous and which one was simply lazy. And he reported this information to Gideon one morning with the gravity of a man presenting his findings. And Gideon had listened and said, "You're right about all three," with a respect that Daniel had needed more than he would have admitted. Tommy had stopped getting into the kind of trouble that caused problems for other people and developed instead a talent for being underfoot in useful ways. Appearing in the kitchen to carry things, appearing in the barn to hold a lantern, appearing at Gideon's elbow with exactly the tool the older man had been about to go looking for. She didn't know if Tommy had figured out that this was how you made yourself indispensable or if he was simply acting on instinct, but either way it was working. And Ronan Voss was still largely absent from her life in any direct sense, which was fine. He came to the kitchen for coffee and occasionally for a conversation that had, over the course of these days, become slightly, not warmer, but less guarded, the way a door that has been stuck opens a little easier once it's been moved a few times. On the morning of the 10th day, he found her in the office. She had not gone there intentionally. She had been looking for a particular ledger to cross-reference the Weller delivery numbers, and she had found it on the shelf and was standing at the shelf reading it when she heard him come in. She looked up. "Weller came yesterday," he said. "I met him on the road. He was short 22 pounds of flour on the delivery." He said it without particular emotion, just the flat statement of fact. "He tried to tell me his scale was off. I told him I knew what 22 pounds of flour looked like, and his scale wasn't off." She set the ledger down. "What happened?" "He'll correct the contract and refund for the last 4 months. Or I take my business to the supply house in Durango, and I tell every rancher I know what he's been doing." He looked at the wall behind her. "He'll correct the contract." "Good," she said. He looked at her then, directly, which he didn't always do. He had a habit of looking at the thing adjacent to the person he was talking to, or at some middle distance, as if direct eye contact was something he'd decided was unnecessarily intimate. But he looked at her directly now. "You've been in this office before," he said. "More than once." She held the ledger. "I've been looking at the supply records." "I know." He didn't say it with accusation. "I've been noticing what you're doing, the cellar, the fence, the window, the accounts." He paused. "You're not just cooking and cleaning." "I told you I could manage a household." "A household," he said. "This isn't a household." "No," she agreed. "But the principle is the same. You look at what's broken and you fix it in order of what matters most." He looked at her for a long moment. "What's the next thing that matters most?" She had already made her list. "The east fence still needs the last 20 yards. The bunkhouse roof has a section that won't hold through a serious winter storm. Your cattle count is off. I don't know if you've lost some or if the count was wrong to begin with, but the number Pete quoted me doesn't match the number in last year's ledger. And you need to hire another hand before the cold comes in because Gideon's joints aren't going to let him pull his full weight in deep winter, and 2 men and a 12-year-old are not enough for this property in hard weather." He stared at her. She said, "You asked." He looked at the desk. Something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. Not quite discomfort, but the expression of a man who has been managing a problem alone and has just had it laid out plainly by someone else, and isn't sure whether what he feels is relief or offense. "The cattle count," he finally said. "I've been worried about that." "Then let's count them." Another long pause. "You're offering to help count cattle." "I'm offering to help with whatever needs doing," she said. "That's what you're paying me for." He looked at her for another moment. Then, for the first time since she'd arrived, not quite a smile, but a loosening of the jaw, the particular expression of someone who has been holding something tight and is beginning, just slightly, to let go of it. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow then, early." She set the ledger back on the shelf, nodded, and walked out of the office, and she went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on. And outside the valley was going gold in the late afternoon light, and she thought, tomorrow. It was enough. They counted cattle the next morning, starting before the sun was fully up, and it took most of the day. Ronan went out with Pete and Marcus on horseback, moving the herd through the south pasture in sections, and Evelyn stayed at the gate with a tally stick and a piece of paper, counting each animal as it passed. Daniel ran the secondary gate. Tommy sat on the fence rail and tried to count along and lost track somewhere around 40 and started over, which was fine. Nobody needed Tommy's count. What mattered was that by mid-afternoon, when the last section had been moved and Evelyn looked at her paper, the number was 112. Ronan's ledger said 127. He stood at the fence with the ledger open in his hands and looked at her number and looked at his number and said nothing for a long moment. Pete was watering the horses. Marcus was watching Ronan's face with the careful attentiveness of a boy trying to understand how a man absorbs bad news. 15, Ronan said. That's the difference. In how long? He said it flat, not a question. The kind of statement that is really a calculation being done out loud. The last count I did myself was 8 months ago. 15 head in 8 months. He closed the ledger. That's not predators. 1 or 2, maybe. Not 15. Evelyn had already thought about this. She had been thinking about it since mid-morning when her running tally had started coming in low. Your south fence and your north fence I've seen. The east fence we've been repairing. What's the west boundary like? He looked west toward the ridgeline. There's a creek along the west side. The cattle don't usually drift that far because the grass is better here. Drifting, she said, or being moved. He turned and looked at her. His face had the stillness of a man who has just heard a thought he'd been avoiding say itself out loud. The Alderman property shares your west boundary, Pete said from behind them. He said it quietly, carefully, like a man who has been wondering when this particular conversation would happen. Ronan didn't look at Pete. He kept looking at the ridge. I know what's on the west boundary. The name meant nothing to Evelyn yet, but she read the silence that followed it the way she had learned to read silences on this property, as the surface of something considerably larger and older underneath. I'll ride the west line tomorrow, Ronan said. He handed the ledger to Pete, turned, and walked back toward the house. Marcus came to stand beside her. What's on the west side? He said low. I don't know yet, she said, but it's something. Yes, she said, it's something. She picked up her tally paper and folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went back to start supper. And she thought that this ranch, which had looked like simply a hard and isolated place from the ridge above it, had layers to it she was only beginning to understand. The name Alderman surfaced fully the following evening, not from Ronan, but from Gideon. The older hand had taken to coming in early for coffee on cold mornings, sitting at the kitchen table while Evelyn worked and not saying much, which she had understood correctly as his version of sociability. He was not an unfriendly man. He was simply a man who had arrived at a point in life where he said things when they were worth saying and didn't otherwise. She set a cup in front of him and asked, without particular emphasis, who the aldermans were. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the window. Harlan Alderman came out here 3 years ago with money from somewhere back east and bought the old Prescott homestead on the west side. Been expanding ever since. He drank. His kind of expansion is the kind that doesn't stop where the fences say it should. He's been taking Voss cattle. Gideon looked at her. Can't prove it. Has anyone tried? A long pause. Ronan rode over there 18 months ago when he first noticed the count going soft. Alderman showed him the line fences, all proper, all straight, smiled the whole time. He set down the cup. A man who smiles while he steals from you is a particular kind of dangerous. She thought about Caleb Mercer, who had not smiled, who had been at least honest about his cruelty. She wasn't sure which was worse. What does Alderman want? She asked. What they always want out here, water and grass and more of both. Gideon picked up his cup again. Ronan's got the best water in this valley. That creek on the west side runs year-round, even in a dry summer. Alderman's water rights are downstream and insufficient. He looked at her. Water is everything out here. You understand that already, I think. She understood it. She'd understood it since the ridge. Ronan won't sell, she said. No, so Alderman removes the incentive to hold. She was quiet for a moment. 15 head in 8 months. That we know of, Gideon said. She poured herself a cup and stood at the counter with it, and thought about the shape of the problem. Not the emotional shape, the practical one. 15 cattle was real money. Continued at that rate, it was enough to break a small operation over a year or two, especially one already running lean, and a man who couldn't prove it was happening had no legal remedy and no leverage. Is there a way to mark the cattle so the origin can be proven? She asked. Gideon looked at her with something that was almost surprise. Brand, you mean? Ronan already has a brand, I've seen it, but if cattle are being taken and moved, the brand could be altered. I've heard of it being done. Hot iron over an existing brand. Gideon nodded slowly. It's been done. Difficult to prove afterward unless you know what to look for. Is there someone in this county who handles legal matters? A land agent or a lawyer? Gideon thought. There's a man in Durango, handles title disputes and grazing rights. Name of Collier. He paused. Ronan knows of him, never used him. Why not? Because using a lawyer costs money and makes enemies, and Ronan has been hoping the problem would resolve itself. She thought about what her mother used to say about problems that are left to resolve themselves. She kept the thought to herself. Thank you, she said. Gideon finished his coffee and set the cup down and looked at her with the particular expression he sometimes wore. Not warm exactly, but something that registered acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge a solid piece of timber by the sound it makes when you knock on it. You're not what he expected, Gideon said. What did he expect? The old man stood up slowly, his joints audible. Someone who'd be gone by now. She did not raise the alderman question with Ronan directly. Not yet. She raised it indirectly, the way she had learned to raise things with him, by leaving the relevant information where he could find it and letting him come to her. In this case, she wrote down the numbers. Total cattle loss estimated at 15 head over 8 months, approximate market value at current Colorado prices, projected loss over 12 months if the rate continued, projected loss over 24 months. She put the paper on the desk in the office and left it without comment. He found it that afternoon. She knew he'd found it because she heard the office chair move and then nothing for a long time. He came to the kitchen doorway that evening. She was making supper. He stood there for a moment without saying anything, and she kept working and let him find his way to it. "You talked to Gideon," he said. "He told me some of it. I worked out the rest from the numbers." He leaned against the doorframe. "Alderman will deny it. His men will deny it. I have no proof." "No current proof," she said. "That's different from no proof being possible." He looked at the stove. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that a man who is taking your cattle has to be selling them somewhere. Cattle that size don't vanish. They go to a buyer, and the buyer has a record, and records can be examined if the right person examines them." She turned to face him. "There's a man in Durango, a lawyer named Collier." Something moved in his face. "Gideon told you about Collier?" "He mentioned him." "Collier charges $20 to look at a case." $20 is less than 1 head of cattle," she said. He looked at her for a moment. That direct look he was using more often now, she'd noticed. "You've been here less than 3 weeks. Is that a reason to be wrong?" He almost smiled. It was the same, not quite smile she'd seen in the office. The jaw loosening, the slight shift. But this time it lasted half a second longer before he pulled it back. "No," he said. "I suppose it isn't." "Think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking." He pushed off the doorframe and went back to the front room, and she heard the sound of papers being moved on the desk, and she went back to the stove. And that evening at supper, Ronan came to the kitchen table for the first time and sat at the end and ate his food there, among Pete and Gideon and the boys, without explanation. Nobody acknowledged it directly. Pete passed the bread. Daniel asked Gideon something about the horses. Tommy reported that he had counted 47 fence posts that day, which was apparently a personal record. Ronan ate and said nothing and looked at the table in front of him, but he stayed. Bam. November came in hard. The first real cold of the season arrived on a Tuesday, the temperature dropping 30 degrees between sunup and sundown. And by Wednesday morning, there was ice on the water troughs and a thin skin of frost on the bunkhouse roof. Evelyn had seen Colorado winters described in James's newspapers as severe, and she had heard Pratt and Blackridge use the word brutal without elaboration, and now, working in the pre-dawn dark to break the ice in the kitchen water barrel, she understood both of those words in a physical way she hadn't before. The boys adjusted. Marcus had developed enough outdoor toughness over the past weeks that the cold was simply another condition of the work he was already doing. Daniel moved his barn visits to mid-morning when the temperature had risen slightly and wore every layer he owned. Tommy had developed a relationship with the kitchen stove that could only be described as devoted. He spent his free time as close to it as possible, which at least meant he was always warm and frequently useful, since there was always something near the stove that needed holding or stirring or fetching. It was on the 3rd day of the cold snap that Gideon didn't come in for breakfast. She noticed it when the food was ready, and Pete came in alone, and then waited 5 minutes more before she said anything. Pete said Gideon had been up. He'd seen him moving around the bunkhouse before Pete had come over. She sent Marcus to check. Marcus came back and said Gideon was sitting on his bunk, and he looked wrong. She left the stove and went out across the yard, not running but moving fast, and she went into the bunkhouse and found Gideon sitting on the edge of his bed with his hands on his knees, and a gray quality to his face that she recognized immediately as the face of someone whose body had turned against him in the night. "How long have you felt this way?" she said. "Since about 3 in the morning," he said. His voice was thinner than usual. "Can you stand?" "I can stand." He stood to demonstrate, and she saw the way it cost him, the set of his jaw, the careful redistribution of weight. He stood, but it was clearly wrong. "You have fever," she said. She put her hand to his forehead, and he tolerated it with the slightly offended dignity of an old man who doesn't like being fussed over. "You're coming inside." "I'm fine." Gideon, you are not fine. Come inside. He came inside. She moved Tommy's cot. Tommy had been sleeping on a pallet on the floor the past week without complaint, having taken it upon himself to give Gideon the cot when the old man's joints had been hurting, into the main room near the fireplace, and got Gideon onto it, and covered him with 2 blankets and went to find Ronan. He was in the barn. She told him plainly Gideon was sick, possibly seriously, and needed warmth and rest and watching. Ronan came inside and stood at the edge of the room and looked at Gideon, and the expression on his face was the one she had not seen before, stripped of the guardedness, open in a way that told her something about how long these 2 men had known each other and what that length of time meant. Gideon had been on this property since before Ronan's wife died, possibly longer. I'm not dying, Gideon said from the cot. Nobody said you were, Ronan said. You've got that face on. I don't have a face on. You've had that face since I met you, every time you think something's going to go wrong. Gideon closed his eyes. I've had this before. 2 days? Maybe 3. Stop looking at me like that. Ronan looked at Evelyn. She said quietly, Let's see how the fever goes. The fever got worse through the day. By afternoon it was high enough that Gideon was confused about where he was. She heard him say a woman's name that wasn't hers, and she didn't ask about it. She put cold cloths on his forehead and made a broth from the bones she'd been saving and got him to take some of it, and she sat with him when he was restless and moved away when he slept. Ronan came in and out of the room all day. He was not the kind of man who sat and watched helplessly. She had already understood this about him, that stillness was not his way of managing fear. He went out and did the work that Gideon would have been doing, and came back in, and looked at Gideon, and went out again. At one point in the late afternoon, she came into the room and found Ronan sitting in the chair beside the cot. He didn't see her immediately, and she had a moment to watch him. This man who had organized his entire life around not needing people, sitting beside a sick old man in the cold, his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them, the particular stillness of someone keeping watch. It was the first time she had seen him fully without his armor, and she stepped back and gave him the room and went back to the kitchen. That evening Marcus found her at the stove. Is Gideon going to be okay? He said. I think so. The fever's still high, but his color is better than this morning. Marcus leaned against the counter. He had Ronan's wood smell now, from weeks of working in the barn, pine sap and horse and cold air. He taught me how to properly tie off a fence post today, he said. Last week, I mean. Before he got sick. He paused. He never says much when he's teaching. He just does it and expects you to watch. That's how he is. I like it, Marcus said. Some people talk too much when they're trying to show you something. She looked at her son, the particular set of his shouldering his weight. In 3 weeks on this ranch, he had changed in ways she could see, and probably in ways she couldn't. You're doing well here, she said. He shrugged with the careful casualness of a boy who doesn't want to look like he cares about a compliment. It's good work. It is. He was quiet for a moment, then, what happens if Alderman keeps taking cattle? She looked at him steadily. You know about Alderman. Pete talks when he's working. I listen. He met her eyes. What happens? Mr. Voss is deciding what to do about it, she said. But you have ideas. I always have ideas. That doesn't mean they're the right ones. Marcus considered this. Gideon says you're the most useful person who's been on this property in years. She turned back to the stove. Gideon is feverish. He said it last week, Marcus said, before he got sick. She didn't answer that, but she felt it in the way you feel something that lands accurately. A small internal shift, a settling. Gideon's fever broke on the 3rd day, which was also the day it started to snow. It came down steady and purposeful from a low gray sky, the kind of snow that is not decorative but structural, that intends to accumulate and stay. By mid-morning, there were 4 inches on the ground, and the mountains to the west had disappeared entirely behind a wall of white. Gideon was weak but clear-headed, sitting up on the cot and eating real food for the first time in 2 days. He ate everything she brought him with the focused efficiency of a man reclaiming territory. She sat with him while he ate and told him about the snow, and he said, without surprise, early this year. Is this typical? Typical is a strong word for Colorado, he said, but not unheard of. November heavy snow usually means a January thaw, evens out. He looked at her. You stayed up with me. Someone needed to watch the fever. Pete could have. Pete needed sleep to be useful during the day. So did Marcus. He ate the last of the broth and held the bowl in his hands. My wife used to do that, he said. Stay up. She said she slept lighter when someone was sick. He looked at the bowl. She's been gone 11 years. I'm sorry, Evelyn said. It's a long time. I've made peace with it. He set the bowl down. You make peace or you don't, and the ones who don't. He looked toward the main room. She understood he meant Ronan without saying it. They lose more than the person they lost. She didn't know how to answer that, so she picked up the bowl and stood. He's better than he was, Gideon said. Since you've been here, not fixed, better. He doesn't need fixing, she said. He needs the ranch to be viable, and someone to share the weight of it. Gideon looked at her with those slow, appraising eyes. Is that all? She went back to the kitchen without answering him. Ronan came to find her that evening. She was at the kitchen table with the ledger and her supply notes, working by lamplight, and the boys were in the back room. She could hear Daniel and Marcus talking in the low, serious way they sometimes talked when they thought she wasn't listening, about their father, about the journey, about things she had learned not to interrupt. Tommy was asleep. Ronan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She looked up. He had the look of a man who has been thinking about something for a long time and has finally decided to say it. I'm going to ride to Durango next week, he said, to see Collier. She set her pencil down. All right. I want to document the cattle count, what we have now, dated and witnessed, and what the ledger shows for the same time last year. Build a record. He paused. If Alderman is selling those cattle anywhere in the region, there will be a bill of sale somewhere. Collier can find it. That's sound thinking. He looked at the ledger. It's your thinking. I'm just deciding to act on it. It's your ranch, she said. The decision is yours. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I want you to come. She looked at him. To Durango. Your name is on the count. You did the original number. Collier will want to talk to whoever kept the tally. She thought about the logistics. The boys, Pete can manage for 2 days. Gideon's on his feet. Marcus? He paused, and something in his face shifted slightly. Marcus has been handling more than his age should require. He doesn't mind. No, Ronan said. He doesn't. That's the thing about him. He looked at the lamp. He reminds me. He stopped. She waited. He shook his head slightly, the way you shake your head at something you've decided not to say. 2 days, he said. We'd leave Monday. All right, she said. I'll come. He nodded and stood, and she thought he was going to leave, but he stayed standing for a moment at the table with his hand on the back of the chair. I found something today, he said, out on the west fence line. He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the table. It was a piece of leather, a small square, tooled with a pattern she didn't recognize, cut or torn from something larger. It was caught on the wire at the break point, where the fence was pulled down. She picked it up. The leather was good quality, not cheap. The pattern on it was deliberate, a small interlocking design that looked like it could have been cut from a saddle or a saddlebag. You've seen this pattern before, she said. She could tell from the way he'd set it down. Alderman's lead hand, he said. He rides with a pair of saddlebags that have that same tooling. I've seen them twice. Once when he was with Alderman at the boundary meeting 18 months ago, and once when I passed him on the road to Black Ridge. He paused. That's not proof. A lawyer would tell you the same pattern could come from anywhere. But combined with the count discrepancy and a matching bill of sale, it builds a case. He picked up the leather and put it back in his pocket. It's the first hard evidence I've had. She looked at him and understood then what this moment was. Not the piece of leather, which was a small thing, but the fact that he had come to the kitchen and sat down and told her. That was the larger thing. This man who had organized his life around managing problems alone had walked into the kitchen and sat down and shared the weight of one. Collier will want to see it, she said. I know. He pushed the chair back under the table. Monday, then. He left the kitchen, and she sat for a moment with the lamp and the ledger and listened to the snow outside and to her boys' voices in the back room, lower now, nearly at sleep. And she thought about Monday, and about Durango, and about the piece of leather in Ronan Voss's coat pocket. And she thought about Gideon saying he's better than he was since you've been here. And she thought about James, the way she always eventually thought about James. Not with the sharp grief of the early days, but with the settled sadness of someone who knows the shape of a loss and has learned to carry it without it breaking her stride. She missed him. She would always miss him. And she was also here, in this kitchen, in this valley, with her boys safe in the next room and work that mattered, and a problem she was helping to solve, and both of those things were true at once. She picked up the pencil and went back to the ledger. The ride to Durango took most of Monday. They left before light, with the horses moving careful through the snow-packed road, and the mountains on either side were white and still, and Evelyn sat the horse Ronan had lent her, a steady gray mare named Patience, which was either a coincidence or a description, and they rode mostly without talking, which she had come to understand was not unfriendliness, but simply his natural mode. An hour out, he said, "How'd you learn to ride?" "My father had horses. We weren't wealthy, but we were country." She looked at the road ahead. "James couldn't ride at all. He learned when we were already on the trail west, which is not the ideal time to learn." A pause. "He sounds like a man who figured things out as he went." "He was," she said. "It was one of the things I loved about him, and one of the things that used to make me furious." She said it plainly, because it was true, and because she had gotten past the point of making James only the good version of himself in her stories about him. Ronan was quiet for a moment. "My wife planned everything," he said, "down to the last nail. She had lists for her lists." He looked at the road. "I used to think it was excessive. After she was gone, I couldn't find anything for 6 months because she'd been the one who knew where it all was." It was the first time he had mentioned his wife directly and voluntarily, without being drawn to it. Evelyn let the statement sit without pushing at it. "Clara," he said. Her name was Clara. He said it with the particular care of a person who doesn't say a name often and feels its weight when they do. "And my daughter was Eleanor. We called her Ellie." "How old was she?" "4. He said it without elaboration, and she understood that 4 was all that needed saying. They rode in silence for a while after that. Not uncomfortable silence, the kind that sits between two people who have each said something real and are giving it room. When they reached the first long descent toward the valley floor, Evelyn said, "Marcus was 6 when we lost his first dog. He didn't cry for 2 weeks, and then he cried for 3 days straight. James and I didn't know what to do with it." She paused. "There isn't a right way to handle a loss. People who tell you there is are either lying or they've never had a real one." Ronan looked at her briefly. "No," he said, "there isn't." "You've been managing yours alone for how long?" 7 years. That's a long time to carry it without setting it down somewhere. He didn't answer immediately. The road leveled out and the snow thinned at the lower elevation, and the horses picked up their pace slightly. "I had the ranch," he said. "That's not the same as someone to talk to." He looked at the road. "No, it isn't." Durango came into view in the mid-afternoon, larger than Black Ridge, with proper streets and a building that had land records in stone above the door, and a row of lawyers' offices on the main street of which Collier's was the third. The sign was modest, the office small and warm, with a man behind the desk who was somewhere in his 60s with the methodical manner of someone who has spent decades reading fine print and has come to appreciate its significance. Collier looked at the ledger. He looked at the cattle count tally in Evelyn's handwriting. He looked at the piece of leather and held it to the light. He asked questions, and they answered them, and he took his own notes in small, precise handwriting, and at the end of it he sat back and laced his fingers together and said, "You have a circumstantial case. You don't have a provable case. Yet." "Yet," Ronan said, "I can write to the stock buyers in a 50-mile radius and request their purchase records for the past 8 months. It's legal if I frame it as a title inquiry." He looked at them both. "If Alderman's man sold those cattle anywhere in this region, someone has a record. And a record plus your count plus that leather is sufficient to file a formal complaint with the county." He paused. "It won't be fast. An alderman has money and will fight it." "I know he'll fight it," Ronan said. "Then you know what you're starting." "I know what he started," Ronan said. "I'm finishing it." Collier looked at him for a moment, then looked at Evelyn. "The count tally. You did this personally?" "I did." "You'd be willing to sign an affidavit to the accuracy of the number and the method?" "Yes," she said. He nodded, made another note. "Give me 3 weeks. I'll be in touch." They rode back in the early dark, torches in hand, and the cold had come down again, and the horses moved fast and warm beneath them. Somewhere around the midpoint of the return road, with the Voss Valley still an hour ahead, Ronan said, "Thank you for coming." She glanced at him in this torchlight. "I don't mean the affidavit," he said. "I mean—" He stopped, worked at it. "I've been on that property for 7 years, and I have never once asked another person to come with me somewhere that mattered." He looked at the road. "I didn't know it would feel different, but it does." She kept her eyes forward. "Most things are lighter when they're shared," she said. He said nothing after that, and they rode the rest of the way in silence. But it was not the silence of two strangers. It was the silence of two people who have said enough for one day and are comfortable with the rest of it going unspoken. When they rode into the yard, the barn light was on, and through the kitchen window she could see the lamp burning and the shape of Marcus moving around inside, and the sight of it, her son, in this kitchen, in this valley, at this hour, hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. She dismounted and handed the mare's reins to Pete, who had come out to meet them, and she stood in the cold yard for a moment and looked at the lit window before going inside. Whatever this place was becoming it surely. That was enough. Collier's letter arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks and 2 days after the Durango trip, carried by a rider from Blackridge, who handed it to Pete at the gate and didn't stay for water. Pete brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table without ceremony, and Evelyn looked at it and left it there for Ronan, because it was addressed to him and it was his business, and she had learned by now exactly where her role began and where it was not hers to reach. Ronan came in at midday and saw it. He stood at the table and opened it with the studied calm of a man who has trained himself not to show anticipation, and she kept her hands in the bread dough and her eyes on her work and waited. He read it twice. She knew it was twice because she heard the quality of the silence change after the first pass. A slight shift, a settling, and then the sound of paper moving as he went back to the top. "He found a buyer," Ronan said. She turned. "A stock operation in Pueblo. 11 head sold in 3 transactions over 6 months, all consistent with the description and brand markings of Voss cattle." He looked up from the paper. "The seller was listed as a private party on 2 of the 3 transactions. The third has a name. Boyd Crane." "Alderman's lead hand," she said. "Yes." He set the letter down on the table, flat, with the deliberate care of a man placing something that has weight. "Collier says it's sufficient to file the formal complaint. He recommends doing it immediately and through the county office in Durango, not through Blackridge." He looked at the wall. "Alderman has friends in Blackridge. Collier's careful about that." "Is there a judge in Durango?" "Circuit judge. He comes through every 6 weeks." Ronan looked at the letter again. "Collier thinks if we file now, we can be on the next docket." She pressed the dough and turned it and pressed again. "What happens to Alderman if the complaint is upheld?" "Restitution for the cattle, possible criminal charge on Boyd Crane, which may extend to Alderman depending on what Crane tells a judge when he's looking at a prison sentence." He was quiet for a moment. "And Alderman loses the expansion argument. If he's documented as having stolen to force a sale, any future claim he makes on this water or this land is tainted." He picked up the letter and folded it. "It doesn't end him. He has money, and he'll move on to something else. But it stops this." "That's enough," she said. "Yes." He tucked the letter inside his coat. "I'm going to ride to Durango tomorrow to file." She nodded and went back to the bread. He was at the doorway when he stopped. He did that sometimes, got most of the way out of a conversation, and then came back to something. She had learned to wait for it. "I'd like you to come again," he said, "if you're willing. Collier will need the affidavit signed in person, and having you there—" He paused. "It matters, having you there." She looked at him. He was looking at the doorframe rather than at her, which was still his habit when he was saying something that cost him something to say. "I'll come," she said. He nodded and went out, and she heard his boots cross the front room and the door open and close, and she worked the bread dough with both hands and thought about what it matters. Having you there actually meant from a man who had spent 7 years arranging his life so that nothing and no one would matter too much. They filed on Friday. Collier met them at the county office with the paperwork already prepared, and Evelyn signed the affidavit at a desk that smelled of wood oil and old paper, and the county clerk stamped it with the particular satisfaction of a man who likes his stamp, and by noon it was done. Collier walked them out onto the main street of Durango and said, with the measured confidence of a man who has won cases and lost cases and knows the difference between the two. Alderman will be served notice by the end of next week. He'll hire a lawyer. His lawyer will try to discredit the buyer records and argue the brand markings are inconclusive. We'll counter with the affidavit and the leather and the tally. He looked at Ronan. Don't let anyone on your property who represents Alderman without me present. If his men come to the fence line, document it. Time, number, what they said. Write it down immediately after. I understand, Ronan said. Collier looked at Evelyn. Your tally documentation was clean. Clear dates, clear methodology, no gaps. That kind of record is worth more than most people realize in a dispute like this. My mother kept accounts for my father's business, she said. She was precise about it. I learned from her. Collier nodded. Precision is undervalued until it's the only thing standing between a man and losing what's his. They rode home in better spirits than either of them acknowledged directly, which was its own kind of ease, the comfort of being with someone you don't have to perform feeling for. The snow had thinned on the lower roads and the horses moved well, and at one point, coming around a bend where the valley opened up below them, with the Voss ranch visible in the late afternoon light, Ronan pulled up and looked at it. She pulled up beside him. He looked at the property below. The house, the barn, the outbuildings, the dark line of the creek along the west boundary, the cattle small in the south pasture. Clara picked this land, he said. I wanted somewhere closer to town. She said this valley was the right shape for a life. He was quiet. I didn't understand what she meant for a long time. What did she mean? He thought about it. I think she meant that the shape of a place gets inside you, that you become the place you live, in some way. She didn't want to become a main street. He looked at the valley. She wanted to become this. Evelyn looked at it too. The light was going gold, and the mountains behind were blue-gray, and the smoke from the chimney rose straight up in the still air, and her boys were down there, in that house, in this valley, becoming something she could not yet fully see the shape of. She was right, Evelyn said. He looked at her briefly. Then he clicked the horse forward, and they went down the road toward home. The notice reached Alderman the following week, and Alderman's response reached the Voss ranch the week after that, not through legal channels, but through Boyd Crane himself, who rode to the east gate on a gray morning with two other men and asked to speak to Ronan Voss. Marcus was the one who saw them coming. He came in from the fence work at a pace that was not quite running but faster than walking, and found Evelyn in the kitchen and said, with the controlled voice of a boy trying to sound older than he was, There are 3 men at the east gate. The one in front has a leather saddlebag with a tooled pattern. She set down what she was doing. Go find Mr. Voss, she said. Tell him calmly. Don't run. Marcus went. She went to the kitchen window and looked out across the yard toward the east gate, and she could see the 3 riders at the fence, sitting their horses with the particular patience of men who intend to be a problem. Ronan came out of the barn. He walked to the gate, the way he walked everywhere, at his own pace, without hurry, which was more unnerving to watch than hurrying would have been. He stopped at the gate and looked at the 3 men across the fence. She watched from the window. She couldn't hear what was said, but she could read the posture of it. Crane doing most of the talking, something in his hands. A paper, she thought. Ronan taking it, looking at it, handing it back. No raised voices visible. No drama in the bodies. Just 3 men on one side of a fence and 1 man on the other side, and the 1 man not moving and not backing up. After 5 minutes, the 3 riders left. Ronan watched them go, then turned and came back to the house. He came into the kitchen and stood at the table. Alderman's lawyer sent a counter notice, he said. Crane delivered it in person, which is irregular and meant to make a point. He set the paper on the table. They're claiming the cattle records are falsified and the tally was conducted by an interested party with motivation to misrepresent. She looked at the paper. They mean me. Yes. She picked it up and read it. The language was careful and legal, and beneath the careful language was a message that was not careful at all. We know who she is, and we will use her against you. They'll argue you have reason to inflate my credibility, she said, because of my position here, that I'm not an objective witness. That's what Collier expected they'd try. What does Collier say? I sent Pete to Durango this morning before Crane arrived. Collier had already anticipated this. He sat down at the table, which he had been doing more often in the past weeks, coming into the kitchen and sitting, without ceremony, as if the kitchen had become a place he was allowed to be. He says the buyer records stand independent of your tally. The tally supports the records. It doesn't replace them. Their case against you as a witness doesn't touch the Pueblo evidence. She set the paper down. They'll still try to use it. Let them try. He said it flat and certain, without the kind of anger that makes a man reckless. It was the certainty of someone who has finally decided to hold their ground. I've been avoiding this fight for 18 months because I thought I couldn't win it. Now I think I can. I'm not backing down because they figured out who to come after. She looked at him. I was looking at the paper, and his jaw had the set of it, the particular set she had come to know. Not stubbornness for its own sake, but the expression of a man who knows what's right and is done negotiating with what's wrong. There's something else, he said. He looked up. Crane said something before he left. While I was reading the paper, he said, he paused, choosing the words carefully. He said that a widow woman with 3 boys and no property of her own was taking a risk getting herself involved in other people's land disputes. The kitchen went quiet except for the stove. He was threatening you, Ronan said. I want you to know that I heard it, and I understand what it was. I know what it was, she said, and I want you to know. He stopped, tried again. If you want to step back from this, from the filing, from being named, I'll understand. This isn't your fight in the way it's mine, and Crane is the kind of man who... Ronan. She said his name for the first time since she'd arrived, directly, without the formal distance of Mr. Voss, and he stopped talking. I signed an affidavit. I signed it because it was true and because it was right. I don't unsign things because someone sits on a horse and says something unpleasant. She picked up the legal notice and set it to the side of the table, out of the center. Make sure Collier knows Crane delivered this in person. Write down the time and the names of the men who came with him. He looked at her for a moment. Today's date, she said. And write down exactly what Crane said, word for word, as close as you can remember. He nodded slowly. Word for word, he said. All right. He got up and went to the office, and she heard the desk drawer open and the sound of paper. She stayed at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface and breathed in and breathed out and thought about Crane on his horse and the particular quality of a threat delivered with a smile. And she thought about Caleb Mercer's door and about the storm in Blackridge and about Kansas, and she thought, I have survived worse than you. Not to Crane. He wasn't there. Just to herself, quietly, in the kitchen of a house in a valley in Colorado, because sometimes you needed to remind yourself what you were made of before you could continue. December came in, and the days shortened, and the ranch settled into the particular rhythm of winter work. Slower in some ways, harder in others, the cold adding an hour to every task and requiring an extra layer of thought about animal welfare and water and fuel. Gideon was fully recovered and was managing the livestock checks with Pete and occasionally Marcus, and Evelyn had settled the household into an efficiency that had taken work to build, but now largely ran itself, which freed her to address the next thing that needed addressing. The next thing was the children, not her boys specifically. They were managing, more than managing, but the fact that Daniel and Tommy had not had any schooling in 4 months, and Marcus had not had any in 6. Marcus could read and calculate. James had seen to that early, with the conviction that a man who couldn't read was a man at other people's mercy. But Daniel's reading was inconsistent, and Tommy's was barely started, and she had been letting the daily urgencies of the ranch crowd it out in a way she was no longer comfortable with. She set up a school at the kitchen table in the mornings, from first light until breakfast, which was the only block of time that could be reliably protected. She used what she had, a Bible for reading text, which she used purely for its prose and not for any other purpose, an almanac that Ronan had in the office, and which turned out to contain a surprising amount of practical mathematics, and a set of maps she found in a box in the storage room that had belonged, she assumed, to Clara. She found the maps on a Thursday afternoon, going through the storage room for something else entirely, and she held them for a moment, good maps, careful ones, with handwritten notations in a script she didn't recognize. Clara's hand, probably. She stood in the storage room with the maps and thought about a woman who had looked at a valley and seen the right shape for a life. And she put them back carefully in their box and then got them out again, because they were useful, and they were maps, and Tommy needed to understand geography. She asked Ronan about them that evening. He looked at the maps for a moment when she set them on the table. Something moved across his face, brief, controlled. She ordered those from a cartographer in Denver, he said. She was interested in where things were in relation to each other. I'd like to use them for the boys' lessons, if that's all right. He looked at them for another moment. Yes, he said. Use them. She taught at the kitchen table every morning. Daniel improved faster than she expected. He had been bored, she realized, in a way she hadn't fully understood. He was a boy who needed material, and once she gave him material, he burned through it. Tommy's letters came slowly but steadily, with the particular stubbornness of a child who has decided to accomplish something and will not be distracted from it. Marcus came to the table one morning without being asked, which surprised her. I don't need arithmetic lessons, he said, with the dignity of a 12-year-old. I know, she said. I'm teaching geography this morning. Sit down. He sat. He was engaged within 3 minutes, which she had expected. Ronan began stopping in the kitchen doorway during the morning lessons, in the same way he had stopped there the evening she'd heard Pete laughing with the boys. He never came in. He stood in the doorway with his coffee and watched for a few minutes and then went on. She acknowledged it once, early, and after that she let it be, because there was no need to make a thing of it. He was a man who had lost a family in this house, and watching another family use the kitchen table in the morning was something she couldn't fully understand from the outside and didn't try to. It was Pete who told her, in the particular indirect way Pete had of communicating things he thought she should know. He came in for his mid-morning coffee one day in mid-December and sat down and said, without preamble, Ellie used to sit at that table. Evelyn looked at him. Ronan's daughter, Pete said. He looked at his cup. She was learning her letters when the accident happened. Clara had a little book she used for it. He paused. I don't say that to make you feel bad. I say it because I think it's why he stands in the door like that, and I think it's why it doesn't break him anymore, the way it used to. He picked up his cup. I thought you should know. She was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Pete. He nodded and drank his coffee and didn't say anything else about it, and she went back to the lesson when the boys came in, and she thought about Ronan in the doorway and Ellie at the table, and she thought about how a place holds the shapes of the people who lived in it, and how some people walk into those shapes and find them unbearable, and others find in them something closer to permission. The week before Christmas, which she marked by the almanac rather than any particular observance, she found Ronan in the barn on an evening when she'd gone to check on a young heifer that had been off her feed for 2 days. He was sitting on a hay bale with no particular purpose, which she had never seen him do. He was just sitting. She checked the heifer, who was mending, and then stood at the stall door and looked at him. He looked back. Long day? She said. Collier sent word, he said. The circuit judge will hear the case in February. Alderman's lawyer filed 3 motions trying to delay it. The judge rejected all 3. That's good news. Yes. He leaned back against the wall of the barn behind him. It's the right outcome, and it still has to be gotten through. She understood. Knowing the right thing was coming didn't make the waiting easy. February is 2 months. 2 months of aldermen's men riding the fence line and Crane sending messages through go-betweens, and he stopped. I'm not afraid of him, he said. I want to be clear about that. I know you're not afraid of him. I'm tired of him, he said. That's different. He looked at the ceiling of the barn. I've been tired for a long time, of managing this alone, of having everything on the same pile. She stood at the stall door and didn't say anything and waited. I know what Gideon thinks, he said. About me. About you being here. He thinks I should. He stopped again. He was not a man who talked around things as a rule. She understood that when he was stopping, it was because the thing he was trying to say required precision, and he wasn't sure he had it yet. He thinks I've been wasting time. Wasting time how? She said, carefully. He looked at her. In the lantern light, the barn was warm and dim, and he looked like a man who had finally gotten tired enough to say the true thing. You've been here 2 months, he said, and I know what I think. I've known it for a while, He looked down at his hands. I spent 7 years not thinking things like this about anyone. It became a habit. She was very still. I don't know what you think, he said, about any of it, about this place or staying or me. He said the last word with a flatness that was not indifference but the opposite of it, the flatness of something he was trying to say without inflating it beyond what it actually was. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm just telling you what's true. She looked at him for a long time. I think, she said slowly, that I came here with 62 cents and a broken wagon and 3 boys who needed somewhere to land, and I was prepared to work for the smallest amount of stability I could find. She paused. I wasn't prepared for any of the rest of it. For this place or for you? She said the last 2 words with the same flat honesty he had used. I'm also not a person who decides things quickly. I had 13 years with James, and I trusted every one of them because I built them one at a time. He nodded. He was listening the way he listened to things that mattered, without filling the space. I'm not going anywhere, she said. That much I know. And I think... She stopped, chose. I think I'd like to know you better. The rest of that, whatever it becomes, we can build carefully. He looked at her with that direct look, the one he had started using more in recent weeks, and something in his face settled. Not relief exactly, but the expression of a man who has been carrying a tension he didn't know he was carrying until it eased. Carefully, he said. Yes. I can do carefully, he said. She almost smiled. I know you can. She stepped back from the stall. The heifer's better. She'll be all right by morning. She left the barn, and the cold outside hit her like a hand, and the yard between the barn and the house was dark except for the kitchen window, and she walked toward the light, and she thought about James, briefly, with tenderness, with the completeness of someone who has fully grieved a thing and carries it now not as a wound but as a part of the shape of themselves. She thought about what she'd said. I wasn't prepared for any of the rest of it. That was true. She had arrived prepared for survival, and survival had led, the way it sometimes does when you're not managing it too carefully, somewhere larger than itself. The day Caleb Mercer appeared at the gate was a Tuesday in late January, 2 weeks before the court date. She was the one who saw him. She recognized him even at a distance. James had described his brother enough times that she had a picture of him, and the man at the gate matched it. Thick through the chest, James's same square jaw on a harder face, a sheep's wool coat. He was alone, which surprised her. She went to the door and looked out. He was standing at the gate without coming through it, which told her something about where he thought he stood. She did not go to him immediately. She went to the office and knocked, and told Ronan there was a man at the gate she recognized. Who? He said. My brother-in-law, she said. James's brother, the one in Blackridge. Ronan put down what he was doing and looked at her. What do you want to do? She thought about it for only a moment. I'll speak to him. I'd like you to stay inside. Are you sure? Yes, she said. She put on her coat and went out across the yard and stood at the gate and looked at Caleb Mercer. Up close he was older than she'd expected. James had been the younger by 4 years, and the 4 years showed on Caleb in a way that she found not satisfying, exactly, but honest. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face the day he'd closed the door, because that day he hadn't had this expression. That day he'd been indifferent. Now he looked like a man who has done something he regrets, and regret has different muscles than indifference and pulls the face differently. Evelyn, he said. Caleb, she said. He looked at the house behind her. You've landed on your feet, I see. I have, she said. No thanks to you. He flinched slightly. I came to... He stopped, started again. I've been thinking about what I did. In October. With the storm coming and your boys there. He looked at the gate between them. It wasn't right. She looked at him. She had thought about this moment. Not obsessively, not often, but it had come to her in quiet moments, what she would say if it happened. She had imagined anger. She had imagined satisfaction. What she actually felt standing here was something much flatter and more pragmatic. No, she said. It wasn't right. I had my own troubles. That doesn't excuse it. No, she said again. It doesn't. He looked at her steadily. I know I can't undo it. I came because James was my brother, and those are James's sons, and I... He stopped. His jaw worked. I should have let you in. She studied him for a moment, the man who closed the door, the man who put the bolt. She looked at him and felt the October street in Blackridge, the cold, Tommy's face pressed into her coat, Daniel's jaw tightening, Marcus with his fists at his sides. And she held all of that, and she also looked at the ranch behind her and thought about what the closed door had led to, by accident, and she thought about James, who had been a kinder person than she was. I know you should have, she said, And I know James would have wanted me to tell you that it's all right. She looked at him. It's not entirely all right, but I have my boys and I have a place, and I am not in the street, so I can tell you that I don't wish you harm. That's what I can honestly offer you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once, slowly, like a man accepting a judgment that is fairer than he deserves. If there's anything, he started. There isn't, she said. Not right now, maybe later, but right now we're settled, and I have enough to manage without adding to it. She looked at him calmly. Go back to Blackridge, Caleb. Live better than you did in October. That's all I'd ask of you. He looked at her for one more moment, then he turned and walked back up the road, and she watched him go until he was around the first bend and out of sight, and then she turned and walked back across the yard and up the porch steps and inside. Ronan was in the front room. He looked at her. He apologized, she said. Did it help? She considered the question seriously, the way she considered all serious questions. Somewhat, she said. Not as much as I thought it would. He was quiet. The things that happened because of that door, she said. The road, this place, this valley. I don't know that I'd undo them even if I could. She looked at the floor for a moment. That's a strange thing to be true. Sometimes the worst things, Ronan said, and stopped, because he was not a man who finished sentences like that, but she understood what he meant. Yes, she said. Sometimes. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, and the fire in the stove was steady, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the valley was white and still, and February was 2 weeks away, and she thought, one thing at a time, in order of what matters most, brick by brick, in the grinding, ordinary way that things actually get built. That was how you did it. That was the only way anyone had ever done it. The 2 weeks before the court date were the quietest and the most tense, which is a combination that wears on people in specific ways. Not the sharp wearing of crisis, but the slow wearing of waiting, like a stone in a boot that isn't large enough to stop you, but is always there. Alderman's men rode the fence line twice in that period. Each time, Pete noted the time and the number of riders, and came in and told Evelyn, who wrote it down in the log she had started keeping in a spare account book, dates, times, observations, anything that might matter later. Collier had said document everything, and she had taken him at his word, and the log had grown to 4 pages over the past month. Ronan saw the riders the second time and came in without saying anything about it, which was its own kind of communication. He sat at the kitchen table and drank his coffee and looked at the table surface, and she put a plate of food in front of him and sat down across from him. They're testing, she said. I know. They want to see if you'll do something they can use. I know that too. He looked up. I'm not going to do anything they can use. I know you're not. She paused. I'm saying it anyway because I think you need to hear it said. He looked at her. Why? Because you've been managing your anger about this for 18 months, and it's sitting in your chest like a stone, and in 2 weeks it's going to be over one way or another, and the waiting is the worst part. And sometimes it helps to have someone say out loud what you're already thinking. She met his eyes. You're not going to give Alderman anything. You've come too far and been too careful. He was quiet for a moment, then, You're right about the stone. I know I am. He almost smiled. The familiar almost, the jaw that loosened for half a second. You're frequently right, he said. It's occasionally annoying. Only occasionally? This time it wasn't almost. It was brief and real, and it changed his face the way a window opening changes a room, and she saw it clearly and filed it in the place where she kept the things she was honest with herself about. Only occasionally, he said, and picked up his fork. The morning they rode to Durango for the hearing, Evelyn woke before the house did and stood in the kitchen in the dark, and made coffee, and thought about James. She did that sometimes still, thought about him in the quiet before the day started, when there was enough stillness to do it properly. She thought about what he would make of all this. The ranch, the valley, the legal fight. Ronan. She thought he would have liked Ronan, in the careful, measuring way James liked people he respected but didn't fully understand. She thought he would have been proud of Marcus, fiercely and without complication. She thought he would have laughed at Tommy's fence post count. She thought about what it meant that she was standing in someone else's kitchen, feeling something close to at home. She did not resolve that thought. She let it sit the way you let coffee cool to the right temperature. You don't hurry it, you don't ignore it, you wait. Ronan came in at first light, and she handed him his coffee, and he took it without comment, which was how their mornings had come to work. And they rode out an hour later with Pete managing the property in their absence, and Gideon in the barn, and Marcus, whom she had left very specific instructions, and who had received them with the gravity of a boy who understood the weight of being trusted. "You'll be fine," she told Marcus before she mounted. "I know," he said. He was holding the gray mare's bridle. "Win," he said. Not loudly, just plainly, to both of them, and then he handed her the reins and stepped back. She looked at him for a moment. 12 years old and already the shape of who he was going to be. They rode. The Durango courthouse was a 2-story stone building that took itself seriously, which Evelyn found reassuring. She had never been inside a courthouse before. The smell of it, old paper, lamp oil, the particular cold of a stone building trying to be warm, was more functional than intimidating, and she walked in with Ronan and Collier and found a seat on the bench behind the plaintiff's table and looked at the room. Alderman was already there. She recognized him because he was the kind of man who occupied a room the way some men do. Not through anything dramatic, but through a settled assurance, the assurance of someone who has rarely had to reckon with the idea that things might not go his way. He was in his early 50s, well-dressed for the frontier, with a lawyer beside him who had the look of someone imported from somewhere with more lawyers than Colorado. His lead hand, Boyd Crane, was not present, which Collier had told them to expect. Crane was a liability, and Alderman's lawyer was smart enough to know it. Alderman glanced at Ronan when they came in. Then he glanced at Evelyn. His expression when he looked at her was the particular expression of a man who has decided to be dismissive and is making sure you notice. She looked back at him with nothing in her face and looked away. The circuit judge was a compact gray man named Beaumont, who moved through the room's formalities the way a man moves through familiar terrain, quickly, without wasted motion, with the specific authority of someone who doesn't need to perform it. He had the case file in front of him and had clearly read it, which Collier had said was not guaranteed and which she found she was grateful for. Alderman's lawyer spoke first. His argument was polished, and his voice was the voice of a man trained to fill rooms. He attacked the buyer records as unverified. The stock operations in Pueblo, he argued, kept imprecise records, and the branded cattle described could match several operations in the region, not only Voss. He attacked Evelyn's tally as the work of an interested party whose position on the Voss property gave her clear motivation to produce numbers favorable to her employer. He spoke for 12 minutes. Collier spoke for 8. He put the buyer records in order. 3 transactions, 2 with the name Boyd Crane as seller, 1 with a private party who Collier had traced through a second source to a man matching Crane's description. He presented the brand analysis, conducted by a livestock authority in Denver, who had reviewed the markings in writing and confirmed they were consistent with Voss cattle. He presented the piece of leather and its provenance, found on the Voss fence line at the point of collapse, matching the known equipment of Boyd Crane. And he presented the log, Evelyn's log. The 4 pages of dated, timed, specific observations about the alderman riders at the fence line. Not accusations, just records. The kind of records that a woman who had learned from her mother how to keep accounts kept without drama. Collier set it in front of the judge and said, "The plaintiff has maintained a detailed contemporaneous record of boundary intrusions over the past month. The pattern of behavior documented here is consistent with an operation designed to intimidate the property owner in advance of this proceeding." Alderman's lawyer objected to the characterization. The judge sustained the objection and then read the log in its entirety, which took 4 minutes, and the room was very quiet while he read it. Then the judge asked Evelyn 2 questions. Had she kept this log herself, and was the record accurate to the best of her knowledge? She said yes to both, simply, looking at him directly. He wrote something down and moved on. Okay. The judge did not rule from the bench that day. Collier had said he likely wouldn't, that he would take the evidence and issue a written decision within 2 weeks. They rode home in the late afternoon knowing only that it was done, which was its own kind of relief even without a verdict. Neither of them spoke much on the road. The mountains held the last light, and the valley below was already in shadow when they descended, and the smoke from the house chimney was the first thing visible in the dimness, and then the barn light, and then Marcus at the gate who had been watching for them and opened the latch when he saw them coming. "How did it go?" he said. "We wait," Ronan said. Marcus nodded like waiting was a result he understood. He took both horses' bridles. Supper's ready, he said. I made the cornbread. He paused. It's a little dark on the bottom. Slightly dark is better than pale, she said. That's what I told Daniel. He said it was burned. It's not burned. It's not burned, she confirmed, without having seen it. He led the horses toward the barn, satisfied. Inside, the kitchen smelled of the soup she had left instructions for, and slightly overdone cornbread, and the particular warmth of a house where people have been going about their business all day. Daniel and Tommy were at the table, and Tommy had an ink stain on his left hand that she chose not to address immediately. And Gideon was in his chair by the stove, and Pete was leaning in the doorway, and the whole scene had about it the comfortable density of a household that has found its own weight and settled into it. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. Just looked, the way you sometimes need to look at a thing before you go into it. Ronan came in behind her. She felt him stop for a moment as well, standing beside her in the doorway. He didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything, and then Tommy looked up and said, "Did you win?" And the moment passed into the ordinary business of supper. "We don't know yet," she said, going to the stove. "But you might win?" "We might." "Okay." Tommy went back to his ink stain, apparently satisfied with those odds. The cornbread was slightly dark on the bottom and fine everywhere else. The written decision arrived 10 days later. It arrived on a Wednesday, again by Ryder from Blackridge, and again Pete brought it in, and again she left it on the desk for Ronan. But this time she stayed nearby, not hovering, but present, in the kitchen where she could hear the office door and the sound of the chair. She heard the chair pull out. She heard paper. She heard nothing for 3 minutes, which was longer than Collier's letter had taken, and in that 3 minutes she kneaded bread dough that did not need kneading. Then she heard him get up and come to the kitchen. She turned. He held the paper at his side. His face was not what she expected, which would have been relief. It was something quieter than relief, something more like the expression of a man who has been cold for a long time and has finally come inside. And the warmth is real, but it takes a moment to reach the bones. "Upheld," he said. "Full restitution for 11 head at current market value. Boyd Crane to be referred to the county sheriff for criminal proceeding. And," he paused, "a formal notation in the county land record that the alderman operation has engaged in fraudulent boundary practice, which attaches to any future land claim they file in this county." She set down the dough. "That last part," she said. "Collier asked for it." "I didn't know he'd asked for it." He looked at the paper. "It means that if Alderman tries this on anyone else in this county, there's a record. He can't start fresh." He looked up. "It's permanent." She thought about that. Thought about permanence. About what it meant that a document somewhere would carry this. That Alderman's future land ambitions would carry the mark of what he'd done here. It was not dramatic justice. It was not the kind of ending you could describe with flourishes. It was a record in a county office, dry language on official paper, and it would sit there quietly and matter in ways that couldn't be fully anticipated, the way all honest records matter, not loudly, but lastingly. "Collier did good work," she said. "He did." Ronan set the paper on the kitchen table. "So did you." She looked at him. "The log," he said. "The judge mentioned it specifically in the decision. He called it—" He glanced at the paper. "He called it meticulous contemporaneous documentation demonstrating a pattern of intimidation." He looked at her. "That was your log." "I write things down," she said. "It's a habit. It's more than a habit." He stayed where he was, across the table from her, and looked at her with the full direct look he had developed over these months. No adjacent distance, no middle space, just her. "I have been trying to think how to say this properly," he said. "And I've decided I don't have proper language for it, so I'll just say it plainly." She waited. "You came here with nothing and you saved this place," he said. Not in a dramatic way. In the quiet, daily, methodical way that actually saves things. The flue, the fence, the accounts, the cattle count, the log, the affidavit, every piece of it. He paused. "I was losing this ranch. Not quickly. Slowly. The way a man bleeds out from a wound he's convinced himself isn't serious. Alderman would have kept taking cattle until I couldn't hold it, and I would have told myself I was managing it right up until I wasn't." He looked at the table. "You stopped that." She said, you would have found another way. Maybe. Eventually. He met her eyes. But you were here. And you are, the most capable person I have ever known. And I don't mean that as a compliment about capability. I mean that I have watched you for 4 months, and I have never once seen you do anything less than exactly what the situation required, even when the situation required something you were afraid of. He paused. You were afraid in Durango, both times. I could see it. Of course I was afraid, she said. Being afraid and doing the thing are not mutually exclusive. No, he said. They're not. He was quiet for a moment. Evelyn, I meant what I said in the barn, about wanting to build something carefully. I'm not. He stopped, started again. I'm asking if you'd be willing to build it, not as a housekeeper, not as someone who works here, as someone who is here, fully. He looked at her steadily. I know it's not simple. You have the boys to think about. You have your own mind about everything, which I have no intention of asking you to give up. I know what I'm asking is large. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about James, as she often did when something large happened. She thought about what it meant to love a person and lose them, and whether doing it again was courage or recklessness. She thought that you could make a case for either, and that the case for recklessness was made by people who had never actually been reckless, but liked the idea of it. And the case for courage was made by people who understood that courage is simply moving forward when you have good reason to, and enough information to decide. She had 4 months of information. She had a man who had held a barn door steady in a storm, and sat beside a sick old friend and listened to other people's children laugh in his kitchen, and said it matters, having you there before he knew what it meant to him. She had a man who had just said, plainly and without decoration, the true thing. Yes, she said. I'm willing. He was still for a moment. Then something in his whole body changed. Not dramatically, not with any theatrical expression. Just the quality of how he was standing altered, the weight redistributed, as if he had been holding something for a very long time and had now set it down. All right, he said. All right, she said. They stood across the kitchen table from each other in the plain winter light, and that was how it was decided, not with any ceremony, not with any performance of the moment, just two people who had looked at each other carefully for 4 months and made a decision based on what they'd actually seen. She told the boys that evening. She told Marcus first, privately, because he was the oldest and he had earned the information before his brothers did. She told him what she had decided and what it would mean for them, that this would be their home, formally, permanently, that they would bear the Voss name if they chose to or keep Harper if they preferred, that nothing would be forced and everything would be decided together. Marcus listened with the particular stillness he had, the stillness of a boy who is processing something at a depth he doesn't yet have words for. When she finished, he looked at the floor and then he looked at her. Is this what you want? He said. Yes, she said. Not just because we need somewhere. No, not just because of that. She looked at him steadily. I would not do this for necessity alone, Marcus. I did the necessary things for necessity. This is different. He was quiet for another moment. Then, he's a good man. He is, she said. He's also difficult and closed in and has a great many habits built around being alone. It will not always be easy. Was Papa always easy? She almost laughed. No, absolutely not. Marcus nodded, as if this confirmed something. Okay, he said. And then, with the sudden and total subject change that was so purely him, can I have Gideon's spare rope? He said he might give it to Pete, but Pete already has 2. Ask Gideon, she said. He went to ask Gideon. She told Daniel and Tommy together, at the table, simply. She said they were going to stay here, permanently, that this was going to be their home, that Mr. Voss was going to be part of their family. Daniel looked at her carefully in the way he looked at things he was calculating. Does that mean we'll have a real school? He said. I am a real school, she said. A building, he said, like other children. I don't know yet. That's something to work on. He seemed to accept this as a reasonable answer, which was Daniel. He required honesty about uncertainty more than he required false certainty. Tommy said, Does Mr. Voss know we're staying? Yes, she said. It was his idea as much as mine. Tommy thought about this. Is he going to eat with us now? At the table? All the time? Probably. Good, Tommy said. He's funny sometimes. He doesn't know he's funny, but he is. She looked at her youngest son, this child who had counted fence posts and climbed loft ladders and slept on a pallet to give his bunk to a sick old man and found his way into the daily life of this ranch with the uncomplicated openness of a person who has not yet learned to protect himself from things. And she thought that whatever she had managed to give her children, she had managed to give them this, the willingness to arrive somewhere new and begin. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does in Colorado. Not a clean arrival, but a negotiation, warm days and cold nights, and mud that made every outdoor task twice as hard, the ground deciding at its own pace what it was willing to become. But it came. By April, the east fence was fully repaired, including the 20 yards that had been the original break point, and they had run new wire along the west boundary with a regularity of posts that made the line visible and official in a way that felt, to Evelyn, like a statement. Alderman's men had not been back to the fence line since the decision. Alderman himself had not made any further contact. Boyd Crane had appeared before the county sheriff in March, and had, Collier reported in a letter, provided additional testimony about Alderman's direct instruction in the cattle operation, which added to the formal record without changing the immediate outcome, but made the permanent notation in the county land records considerably more substantive. Ronan read Collier's letter at the kitchen table and said, "It's done." "Yes," she said. He folded the letter. "I don't feel the way I thought I would." "How did you think you would feel?" He considered it. "Larger, maybe. It went on for so long that I expected the ending to feel proportional." He looked at the folded letter. "It just feels finished, quiet." She thought about that. "I think that's what a right outcome feels like," she said. "It doesn't arrive with noise. It just arrives." He looked at her. "That sounds like something your mother would have said." She was surprised into a small laugh. "It does, actually. She was a practical woman." "So are you." "I'm not entirely practical," she said. "I just prioritize it." He set the letter down. "What would you call the unpractical parts?" She thought about it honestly. "I fell in love with this valley the first morning I woke up here and saw the light coming across the ridge," she said. "That wasn't practical. I just didn't say it out loud because there were other things to do." He was looking at her with the full direct look. "I knew from the beginning this was the right shape," she said. "For a life. The right shape." She met his eyes. Clara was right about that. He was still for a moment. "Yes," he said, and his voice was different on that single word. Lower, realer. She was. They sat at the kitchen table in the April morning light and didn't need to say anything else. And didn't. The school was Daniel's doing, in the end. He had asked about it in February, and she had said something to work on, and Daniel had taken that as permission to work on it. He had, without telling her, asked Pete about the disused school building in Black Ridge. Pete had asked his contact in town. The contact had found out that the school had been closed for 2 years because the last teacher had left and the town had not replaced her, and that the town council had been looking, with limited success, for someone willing to take it on. Daniel presented this information to her on a Tuesday evening in April, with the formal manner of a 9-year-old who has done thorough research and expects it to be acknowledged. She sat and listened to all of it. "You talked to Pete," she said. "Pete talked to his friend. I just asked Pete." "And you think I should take the school?" "You teach every morning," he said. "You know how to do it. And there are other children who don't have anyone to teach them." He looked at her with James's eyes, which he had always had most purely of the 3 boys. "You said being useful in the world was the point. You said that when Papa died. In Kansas." She did not remember saying exactly that, but she remembered the feeling she'd been trying to put into words, and she recognized that Daniel had found them. She talked to Ronan that evening. He listened to the whole thing, Daniel's research, the council's need, the logistics, without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How far is Black Ridge?" 5 miles, maybe 6. "You'd ride there and back?" 3 days a week, probably, not every day. He nodded slowly. "The boys would come with you on the school days." "Yes, and the ranch management would continue as it has been," she said. "I'm not proposing to stop doing what I do here. I'm proposing to add something." She paused. "If it's too much, I'll know quickly and we'll adjust." He looked at the window. You've been managing this household since October, and you still found 4 pages of extra time to keep a legal log, he said. Is that a yes? It's an observation, he said. But yes. He looked at her. Write to the council. She wrote to the council. The council wrote back in 12 days with an offer, modest wages, use of the building, and the expectation that she could begin by May. She wrote back and accepted. When she told Daniel, he received the news with the particular dignity of a boy who has set something in motion and is trying not to look too satisfied with himself. You're welcome, he said. I didn't thank you. You were about to. She was, in fact. Thank you, Daniel, she said. He nodded and went back to his reading, which was, she noticed, 3 levels more advanced than it had been in October. So began teaching in Blackridge on the first Tuesday in May. The school building was smaller than she'd imagined, and the desks were mismatched. And there were 11 children the first day, ranging from 5 to 13, which was the standard condition of a frontier school, and which she had prepared for by thinking carefully about how to divide the morning so that different ages were doing different things at the same time without chaos. She managed it. Not smoothly. The first day was genuinely difficult, and the second day was better, and by the third day she had a system. The children came from the ranches and the few households in and around Blackridge, and they came with the wariness of children who haven't had consistent instruction and aren't sure what to make of someone who is offering it. She recognized that wariness. She had felt a version of it herself, arriving at unfamiliar doors. She won them over the way she won everything over, incrementally, through demonstrated competence and the consistent absence of cruelty. She was not a soft teacher. She had standards, and she held them. But she was fair, and children understand fairness the way they understand weather, immediately, in their bodies, before they have words for it. By June, she had 14 children. By August, 17. Marcus had turned 13 in June and had, with the matter-of-fact adaptability that characterized him, found his footing between the school days in Blackridge and the ranch work on the other days. He was splitting his own posts now, not just helping carry them, and Gideon had taken to consulting him on small decisions about the herd with a respect that was entirely genuine, and that Marcus absorbed without letting it make him careless. Daniel had made a friend in Blackridge, a boy named Sam, whose father ran the feed store, who came to the school and had the same practical hunger for information that Daniel had, and who had become Daniel's near-constant companion on school days, which meant that Daniel came home on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays, talking at a rate that made Tommy look quiet. Tommy had learned to read fully and completely by March, with the thoroughness of a child who had decided a thing and would not be argued with about it, and was now working through the almanac with a focus that Evelyn found both admirable and faintly comic, given that the almanac was primarily a weather and agricultural reference, and Tommy was 7. Why the almanac? Ronan had asked him once, genuinely curious. It tells you what's coming, Tommy had said, as if this explained everything, which perhaps it did. They married in September, when the valley was going gold and the mountains had their first snow on the peaks, not yet descended to the lower elevations but visible, a reminder of what was coming, a reminder that they had gotten through it before and would again. The ceremony was at the ranch, which was the only place that made sense. Collier rode out from Durango and brought his wife. Pete wore his good shirt, which Evelyn had washed and pressed the day before without being asked, and he stood with his hands at his sides and looked more moved than he would ever have admitted. Gideon wore his good shirt as well and stood beside Pete and was quiet in the way that meant he was feeling something deeply. Marcus stood beside Ronan. He had asked to, privately, a week before, and Ronan had said yes without ceremony and then had apparently taken Marcus aside the following morning to talk. She didn't know what they said. She hadn't asked. That was between them. And whatever was said, Marcus had come back with a different quality of ease around Ronan than he'd had before, something that was less man I respect and more man I know. Daniel and Tommy stood with her. The words were brief and plain. There was no minister. She had asked Collier if it could be done without one, and he had confirmed that in Colorado a civil ceremony was entirely legal and entirely valid, and they had taken that option without discussion because neither of them had any interest in performance for its own sake. She had worn the blue dress she had been keeping at the bottom of the wagon trunk since Memphis, the one she had never worn during the journey because there was no occasion for it and she'd been afraid of ruining it. She had thought she was saving it for some future occasion she couldn't specify. She understood now that she had been saving it for this one. Ronan took her hand and held it and said the words, and she said hers. And it was not a theatrical moment, but it was a true one, which is the only kind that actually holds. Afterward, at the table that they had carried outside because there were too many people for the kitchen, Collier and his wife, Pete and Gideon, the boys, and two neighboring ranch families who had come in recent months into the general orbit of Voss ranch life, in the way that people do when a property starts to feel alive again. There was food and noise, and Daniel's friend Sam had somehow been invited and was telling Tommy something that Tommy was absorbing with deep seriousness. She stood at the edge of the yard and watched it. Ronan came to stand beside her. "You're not inside," he said. "I'm looking," she said. He looked too. The table was full and the day was warm and the mountains behind them were blue and white, and the valley held all of it. The voices, the noise, the children's movement, the old men's stillness, the ordinary, irreplaceable fact of people gathered in a place that was alive. "She was right," Evelyn said quietly. He knew what she meant. "Yes," he said, "the right shape for a life. Not a perfect shape, there was no such thing, and she had stopped wanting one somewhere between Memphis and Kansas, or maybe in Kansas, or maybe on the ridge above this valley looking down at smoke from a chimney and deciding to go toward it. A life has the shape it has, built from what you find and what you survive and what you choose to do with the space between those two things." She had lost a husband in the middle of a Kansas plain and stood in a muddy street in Black Ridge with 3 children and 62 cents and a door closed in her face. She had driven a broken wagon through a mountain pass. She had fixed a flue and counted cattle and kept a log and signed an affidavit and ridden to Durango twice and stood in a courthouse and said yes to 2 questions under oath. She had taught herself to read an unfamiliar landscape and learned to trust a man who did not give his trust easily, which made the receiving of it mean something. She had not been rescued. That was the thing she needed to be clear about, inside herself, where the real accounting happens. No one had rescued her. Ronan had given her work, and then a home, and then himself. And all of those things were gifts, and she was grateful for them. But she had arrived at each of them through her own particular competence, her own willingness to show up and do what the situation required without waiting for permission or perfect conditions or the guarantee of a good outcome. The frontier did not offer guarantees. It offered land and weather and work and the occasional neighbor and long stretches of silence in which you either found out what you were made of or you didn't. And the finding out was not always comfortable and not always flattering and sometimes left marks that didn't go away. She had marks. She would always have them. But she was standing in a valley in Colorado in September with her boys growing in ways she could see and ways she couldn't, and a man beside her who had learned to set things down instead of only carrying them. And the table was full, and the smoke was rising from the chimney, and the right shape of a life was not the one you planned from a comfortable distance, but the one you built from whatever you actually had in your hands. Ronan took her hand. She held it. Down at the table, Tommy had climbed onto his chair to say something important, and Daniel was pulling him back down, and Marcus was watching both of them with the expression of a 13-year-old who has decided he is too old for this, but cannot quite look away. And Pete was laughing, and Gideon was not laughing, but his eyes were doing the thing they did when he was close to it. She watched all of it. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the world to make a place for them, and the world, indifferent, occupied with its own business, never does. The place has to be made. With a fixed flue, an accounted herd, and a careful log and the willingness to sign your name to the true thing. With the decision, made not once but daily, to stay and work instead of leave and wait. She had made that decision in a muddy street in October with a storm coming, when there was nothing left but the decision itself. She had not known where it would lead. She had only known that moving was better than not moving, that doing was better than waiting, that a woman with 3 sons and 62 cents who was done with closed doors was not, in fact, at the end of anything. She had been at the beginning. The valley held the evening light, and the table held her family, and Ronan's hand was warm and real in hers, and the mountains behind them were ancient and indifferent and beautiful, and this, exactly this, imperfect and full and entirely hers, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.